a moot point. I'll open up. It's just one more speaker, Ms. Badal, and after that we'll open up to open debate, and that's going to be very, very interesting, and I'm sure fiery, hopefully as well. Point being made here for the opposition to note is that Yogendra's point is that the entry barriers are so difficult that the youth of this country can't afford to participate in politics, and he argues that only dynasties control...
That's incorrect.
Well, you say it's incorrect, you can defend that, but after our last speaker, who is Vipul Nanda from Bangalore's National Law School of India. Vipul, our last speaker against the motion, you can wrap this up before we go into open debate. Vipul.
Thank you, Arnab. I think when you speak of political judgment and skill, the question to ask ourselves is, our representatives, are they supposed to be exercising their own judgment, their individual opinions, their consciences, or are they supposed to be representing us and our constituencies and our opinions and our ideals? The problem here is when you assume that our political class must exercise their judgment from some sort of elite educated perspective upon individuals who don't have that opinion, who have not voted for them for that reason, who have not voted on them on the basis of any sort of ideology, but have voted for them because they believe that this person is the one who will fight their fight for them. When we look at the rise of regional politics, when we look at the rise of identity politics, it comes not from individuals trusting the judgment of their representatives, but recognizing that having representation is the first step to political awakening. We're at that stage of transition where we recognize that these communities are finally speaking out and having a political voice. But we can't keep saying that the representatives are failing them if the information, the election, and the kind of politics that gets played into putting those representatives there continues to be what the electorate wants. We can't question. It's not like these families have decided somehow or skewed the process or they're fixing the election. That's not probably true, at least at that basic bedrock we have to assume that's not. And if we assume that, people want them to be there. If there are certain families who've captured certain lanes, it's because they could, because people allowed them to do so, and any sort of opposition that has ever come up has not gotten enough democratic traction, right? Which brings us back to the fundamental questions of this debate. Now, when we look at the idea that there are only 943 women for every 1,000 men in this country, that's bad enough. But when we look at that in the age group between 0 to 6, that's 913, which means in the last 10 years, in spite of social activism which our political class has done, in spite of all sorts of measures that they've done in terms of social welfare, in terms of giving incentives, in terms of criminalizing sex determination before the birth of the child, and worse still, in urban areas, in the most affluent districts, that number is 905 for every 1,000 men. Now that effectively means, Amartya Sen says 100 million women have just disappeared. What about their aspirations? You can't blame this on the political class. It's so easy to say that that leader made this happen. That's just not true. Because these leaders have done everything that you can reasonably conceive that they can. They have tried to install some sort of regulatory mechanism on being able to determine the gender of the child. They have tried to do whatever they can to educate in this sort of scenario. They've done what they can to uplift women as much as they can, or maybe they failed in some ways at all. But you can't blame societal ills and societal perceptions upon individuals who are supposed to represent that perspective in society and labor under that perspective. These people aren't some sort of leaders as we understand them to be. They are our representatives and they are supposed to be our voice. And if our voice happens to be telling them to do these things which from our upper class, our upper middle class perspective we think to be evil or pernicious or uneducated or illiterate, isn't that our fault more than it's theirs? If we don't go out and we don't try to educate people, if we don't go out and talk about the issues that are important, if we sit here and talk and recognize that most people in this country will not be watching this broadcast because they either don't have access to television, don't have access to cable, and certainly don't have Airtel, Dish TV on any of those, that clearly means at some basic level, information isn't reaching these people. And the reason for that is either we are apathetic, we don't care, and the people who have the knowledge and who have the information are happier sitting on it, going and watching Rang De Basanti, turning up for a few morchas. In spite of this new political activism we've had in the youth, the voter turnouts are still ridiculously low for the upper class urban youth. Where are we going with this? We can't keep blaming people and we keep talking about how politicians pass the buck. Look at us. We continuously say this party is bad, we bring in a new party, that party is bad, we keep finding things that are flawed to them because we aren't getting what we want, we aren't getting our jobs. But when when governments bring in things like the NREGA, instead of arguing about how it's being dispersed, they said, what are those people doing? Why do they need employment guarantee? Why do they need food security? Because they're starving. Why do they need a right to information? Because they need to know. How can we operationalize a right to education? Some people will not get it. Well, it's important for everyone to have education and we ought to make the effort. Let's stop trying to say that we need to sit in our homes and get everything delivered to our doorstep, and let's take responsibility for our actions, especially in the political arena, because the political class is everyone, because we're in a democracy and everyone gets to vote. Thank you.
Vipul, thank you very much. Vipul says caste and identity politics is because of society, not created by politicians. He says this despite Mandal and VP Singh. He says this despite Babri Masjid and LK Advani. Now, is caste and identity politics happening because of society or due to the politicians who encourage it? This is another controversial issue which will come up for debate. Shankar, your thoughts on the basic points we've raised so far. And after this, we are going into a 10-15 minute open debate route. Shankar.
To my mind, the people arguing against the motion have made two fairly important points. One is that the political class doesn't exist in a vacuum. It merely represents or is thrown up by the rest of society. Right. And therefore, to draw this distinction between the two as if they're two separate entities doesn't make much sense. To which Yogendra responded by saying that the lanes are closed. Yogendra, if I might, you are the surest illustration of how the lanes aren't closed. You are today part of a party which has been in existence for less than a year, if I'm not mistaken, and you are out there campaigning, saying, we are leading the race in Delhi today.
You agree
so the lanes
me?
are not as closed as you think they are.
I'm glad you
as
agree
the youth
with me.
tends to think they are. So that's one important point that the people arguing against the motion have made. The other is, what is the yardstick by which you measure what the political class has delivered? You can have an absolute yardstick which says all aspirations have to be met, and that clearly will never happen. Or you can have a relative yardstick. One sort of relative yardstick is the sort that Mr. Pilot suggested, which is compare yourself with what's happening in your neighborhood or in the rest of the world. Another sort of yardstick is the sort that Ms. Badal was talking about. You look at where we were so many years ago and look at where we are today. So those, I think, are two powerful arguments made by the people arguing against the motion. The arguments made by those for the motion are, well, as you said, powerful even before this debate began. So I think those are the points that this side really needs to respond to. You, of course, need to respond to the charge that, some fairly obvious things that they said, which is, why are we 67 years after independence where we are? And it's one thing to say we couldn't have achieved everything. It's another to try and explain away how, in some cases, we have slid from where we were. We aren't even moving in the right direction. Criminalization in politics today is far greater than it ever was. I'm sure you'll admit that. So it's not even a movement in the right direction. That is something that the political class does need to account for. Corruption. Again, the perception, and if it's not a reality, you'll need to convince us on that, is that things are worsening, not improving. So that's not a matter of absolute versus relative yardsticks. Yep. It's a question of moving in the wrong direction altogether.